Welcome everybody. And what I want to do today, and Sebastian already talked about it a little bit, right, is talk about the fact that even though APIs are, I would say, one of the foundational and absolutely necessary building blocks of digital transformation and pretty much anything digital happening today, it's not enough to just look at the technology part of it. And what I want to do today is spend a little bit of time talking about the problems that can happen, where these problems typically happen, how we can address them by not just thinking about APIs so much as something technical, but mostly as a communication mechanism, right? And sometimes I think just the term API itself already is probably not a good term, but this is we're stuck with that, so we have to keep it. But it's something where I think sometimes we have to spend a little bit more time thinking about what are we trying to accomplish with APIs. I think that is an important thought to have. And I want to end by giving you a couple of very simple, what I call amplifiers, just ways of how you can make sure that whatever you do in the API space, if you have a technical focus, how you can make that maybe work a little better by also looking at some of the not so technical things that I think can really make a difference. So let's jump right in. What you see here is a simple chart. It's from a McKinsey report. It doesn't really matter so much. There's a lot of research out there that looks at how well do API initiatives work. And one thing that you can see is that they typically are not working as wonderful as people are hoping they would. But it's even more interesting in my mind to look at when the problems happen. And what you can see here, I blurred out a little bit of text so that you don't read too much. What you can see here is that a lot of the problems that happen during scaling, meaning that getting started with APIs is typically not so hard. In the end, it's not super duper complicated, right? Everybody can kind of come up with some initial APIs and maybe build applications on top of it. So that's something that's doable. But then when you want to roll it out into the organization, this is often where you see problems happening. And I think it really is important not just to think about that the API investments sometimes aren't paying back quite as much as people want them to, but also when that happens, right? And keep in mind, right? So the quality, the problem is in the scaling. And when we look at why we're even doing APIs, and I think it's really important to do that. What you see here is, this is my personal favorite definition of digital transformation. I like it because it's very short, and I think it does capture the main aspects of it. It's from an article in Harvard Business Review, and it says, digital transformation means adapting an organization's strategy and structure to capture opportunities enabled by digital technology. Right? It's very, very short. And it is, I think, really important to, you can actually dissect this sentence pretty nicely, right? And you can say, okay, of course it's about digital technology and the opportunities that they give us. But it's also talking about that the business needs to have the right mindset to see them and to try to capture them, right? So that's important. That doesn't happen by default. And then also the organization needs to be able to actually do that, right? And this is where also, this is something where the organization needs to be set up in a way that it works, where instead of having these long projects where a lot of coordination is happening, instead of this, you're much more agile, right? So you have more autonomy in teams, the teams have more ability to work, and you have more decoupled teams. And when you look into this, right, of course, APIs are important here, because if one team produces something and the other team wants to use it, if you have an API, they don't even have to talk to each other. So that's really nice in terms of decoupling. But you also need to have those teams being in that work mode, right, where they feel that they can do it, where they have the right incentives in place to actually do it, and so forth. So it's important to really see that all of these things need to fall into place. Otherwise, things won't happen quite as well. And one of the quotes that I recently found, and I really liked it, was on Twitter. And somebody wrote, "The secret is not microservices, but it's micro products." And I really loved that, because as simple and maybe also not super complicated as it is, right? It really takes away the focus from microservices as something where people become really fascinated by this technology and they spend a lot of time trying to get it working and so forth. And it tells us that's okay. But the reason why we're doing that, right? The reason why microservices are such a big thing is not because they are containers, or you can scale them up with Kubernetes, or whatever it is that you want to do. The reason is that you have now these micro products, these little self-contained pieces that you can build easily, change easily, use easily, reuse easily, recombine easily, right? And for all of this to work, you need this bigger picture. You cannot just say that once we've done microservices, everything else is just gonna magically fall into place, right? That's not gonna happen. And this is particularly important, I think, when you are looking at non-digital organizations, right? At organizations that traditionally have not spent this much time in the digital space, that maybe also have spent much more time in a space where the market just changes much more slowly, where the way how you have to develop product and how you have to learn about your consumers and how you have to reach your consumers also changes much more slowly. And these organizations just have so much catching up to do. And the catching up is not just in using containers, right? The catching up is really in being able to understand what digital opportunities really mean, right? What is it that I can do? What can I do in this new digital universe that will make my customers more happy, or that will make them change from the competition to me, or whatever it is that you want to achieve. And it also means that in organizations, and this I think is a really tricky one, right? You have to understand that people need to think of what they are doing as providing building blocks, right? They are creating building blocks and they're using building blocks, and everybody is contributing to this puzzle of building blocks, right? Instead of just saying, oh, this is me, this is my project, I don't care what the others are doing, this is my thing, right? If you think that way, and I think that is in traditional organizations very much the way people think, it's like, I'm owning all of this, right? And I think this also is something that has to change. And then when these things are in place, right, and these are hard things, then technology, of course, also needs to be in place. But the longer I do what I do, the more I'm always thinking that once the problems that you're discussing are technology problems, and these are the only really problems that you're discussing, then you have solved all the hard problems, right? So the technology problems typically are not really the hard ones. And I think it's important to always keep that in mind, and to keep in mind that technology really is important, but sometimes it's actually the easiest of those three. Now, how can you change things a little bit? And I know that it's hard to change things, in particular in organizations that are not digital by nature. And thinking the API way, I think this is something that we have to teach more and more people also throughout the organization, right? Where we say, whatever we build in the organization, wherever we put resources to create something, that becomes a building block. Somebody else has to be able to use it, because we don't want to just invest in it for one thing that we do. It has to become something where we can say, oh, this is nice, now we are also using it over here in a different app, or whatever it is that you're building, right? And this is really, I think, also a cultural shift that is hard for some people to more become, and I don't want this to sound negative, even though it might, right? But you're more like a cog in that big machinery that has to work well, right? So then everybody is building these cog wheels, and everything needs to fit together, and nobody can just stand on the side and say, oh, I'm doing something entirely different, because that's what I like doing, right? That is not a good mindset when it comes to building up a set of capabilities that you can more easily reuse, recombine into digital products. And in order for this to work, what is also necessary, and this can be hard sometimes, right? Digital needs a certain critical mass to take off, right? Once you start with APIs, in the beginning you maybe don't have that many, right? And this is where it becomes important that you think about how do we get to the point where we actually see critical mass being achieved and then things take off. And I think this is really something where we have to think about that APIs are an investment into the future, into this set of cogwheels, building blocks, whatever you call them. And whenever I talk to organizations and I feel this mindset of, yeah, we do APIs when we've done all the other stuff that we need to do, right? Sometimes it's really this mindset of, well, I have to do so many things and now I also have to do APIs. I don't know why I should even do that, right? It makes my life harder and people start using my things and now I have to care for those people. So it may be something that is kind of in the way. So, and that is something that really has to change, right? You have to make it clear to people that this idea of everybody collaborating through APIs is important. And the reason for that, and now we get to the title of my presentation, is the network effect. Right? I'm sure most of you are familiar with the network effect. So the network effect is something probably the most famous example is the telephone. Right? One person having a telephone doesn't do any good. Two people having a telephone still is not very exciting. They can just call each other. But the more people you have, the more telephones get interesting because you are reaching more and more people. This is known, and here on the left-hand side you can see it, sort of the traditional network effect is called Metcalfe's law, where you say that the value of a network grows with the square of the size of the network, because you say the individual connections that I can create, that goes up by square, right? So that is something where you say the more of these things I have, the more I can combine them. And that is something that's true for the API world as well. What is really interesting, I think, is there's a more modern take on the network effect, which is called Reed's law. And what Reed's law tells us is that things might even be more interesting, because if you have these many things, now the more different players you have in a network, the more those players can build kind of interested subgroups, right? And say, oh, those three are doing something together, and these two are something together, right? So, and this gives such a network even more dynamic, because once you cover all these parts, now suddenly these subgroups can start do interesting things and further rise the value of the network. And in my mind, there's quite a bit of similarity to APIs, right? Where it's the same thing, where you have to keep in mind, what can I do with the APIs that are around? What is a set of APIs that may be very useful to build new things around it? For example, a set of customer APIs that give me information about customers, customer history, customer trends, maybe whatever additional information you have about customers, right? So what is a useful set of APIs where others then can build new things with it? And the more you identify these sets of APIs that form a useful set of capabilities, the more likely you get to the point where people realize that, this API thing actually is very interesting, because now I can suddenly start building things I couldn't build before because I couldn't get to this information, which was hidden somewhere in some system. And now I can just get to it because we have an API for it. And it takes some effort to get started with this, right? Because you need to reach critical mass. But I think it's really important to keep this in mind, because once you have reached critical mass, right, you get these things that happen, people notice, you actually see the value being realized, you maybe see new customers signing up, you may see sales going up, whatever it is that you're doing. But you do see that, oh, now we can actually do useful things. And this is the point where you need to get to, so that people start realizing that, yeah, there's something to it. Maybe we want to be part of this as well, right? So we'll get over to this side where all the APIs are being created. And in order to do that, I want to conclude this keynote with giving you 4 simple, what I call API amplifiers. Simple ways of how you can do things, think about APIs that hopefully help you a little bit, thinking the API way, helping others to think the API way, so that the organization as a whole moves faster towards this idea of getting to the critical mass and getting into the interesting area of where the network effect takes off. So one of these things is active portfolio management. You might be able to tell I'm a cyclist, I like riding my bike, and some of you probably do other things where they need tools. And there's a similar thing here where you can say, if I want to maintain my bike, if I want to do interesting things with my bike, there's a certain set of tools I need to just do the most fundamental things. And then there's more to do more elaborate things, right? And the same is true for APIs. So active portfolio management means that you look at the APIs that are there and you really ask people, what are you missing? What would you like to do? Where do you have cool ideas? Where do you have projects coming up where you would like to get something done? And you can't because you can't get to certain capabilities inside of our organization, right? And if you identify those things, that's a very good indication that we should probably build an API for that. And the upside of this strategy also is now that you have concrete data that somebody wants this API, you have somebody you can design that API with, right? You can talk to them and you can tell them, look, let's design this API together. You want to get to this? I can get you to this. Let's build this API together. You are the consumer, I'm the producer. We can create a design, we can iterate on it, and then we're all happy. Right? So that means that you show people that you're actively managing this portfolio and that you are taking a very proactive role in identifying missing pieces and filling those gaps. The second thing is that depending on who you talk to, and this is a video I recorded a while ago, when you explain what you're doing, in many cases, maybe don't say API. I've seen so many people when you talk to them who are not in the API space, right? When you say API, you see their eyes glaze over. It sounds very technical, whatever. In the end, what you want is you want to tell them that I can help you to get access to something that is of value. The API is just the access mechanism. So the long story for this video is that I'm just talking about the API sort of is just the bottle or the can. The real value is the beer, right? So the exciting part is not the API. The exciting part is not the bottle or the can. The exciting part is that I can get beer and bring it home, right? And for APIs, it's very similar. People are not excited about APIs, and that's totally okay. But they are excited when they can build cool new apps because they can use an API that provides them access to a capability that they need to build this cool new app. Right? So try to not say API as much and instead try to focus on asking people, how can I help you to build the app that you want to build? What's missing? What can I bring to the table for you? And then you go to, okay, and now we have to build an API for that. But that's more like, okay, now we actually have to make it work. But first you have to find out what do we need to get stuff done. Number 3. Even though it's good to start small and to always start with somebody who's really interested in actually getting an API for something, it also, in my mind, is really important to always plan for scale and diversity. So even though you may start small, architecture-wise, I think it's a really important consideration to always think about that hopefully your API landscape will grow, it will grow faster, it will grow in more diverse ways. You might add new API styles, so maybe you start with RESTful APIs, maybe then you add some GraphQL, maybe then you add some event-based APIs. Can you do that? Or is your API platform somehow limited to only being able to do one thing? So even though you should start small, I think planning for scale and diversity is something that is really important, so that you never, once you do reach the point where things take off, that you don't have at some point to say, hey, wait a minute, let's take it slow here. I have to rebuild everything because I didn't plan for this, right? So in my mind, really keeping that in mind, that success means that this thing is growing in a way that is faster and more diverse than you could ever imagine in the beginning. That is really important. And also decentralization is an important part of that, where maybe in the beginning there is a centralized team that helps people with APIs, but over time, as different business units, for example, get more mature, you also have to have a good model in mind how you can just let them loose and say, you know what, you people are really good enough at building APIs. You just go and build your APIs. All that we want you to do is tell us about the APIs that you're building so that we can let everybody know, and you can just go your way, and we trust you that you do good stuff. Which brings me to number 4. And that is another little video that I just recently did. I think the next thing in API management, so to speak, actually is API marketing. Meaning that in the beginning, oftentimes you see in organizations you have to explain a lot about what APIs even are, what a good API is, how to design an API, how to implement an API, like all the basics of kind of API stuff. But once you have more maturity along that way, where people start saying, okay, you know, I've got it. I've built enough APIs to understand how to build them. I design them in a way that is good enough. Now the question is, how do we make them as easily findable and available as possible? And I think there's a lot of talk about API products, right? Really treating an API as a product, as something that is consumable. And when you look at what happens in pretty much every mature product space, there are products and then there's product marketing, right? And marketing really is just, you think about, how can I make sure that everybody who could benefit from this product learns about that this product exists and they could benefit from it, right? That is essentially what marketing is all about. It's like identifying the market for a product and trying to make sure that everybody in that market learns about the product and then hopefully starts adopting it. And I think in the API space, so far, we're not quite there yet. We're still very content in just building them and maybe making them available in a portal. But we're not quite there yet as really marketing them, right? Really thinking about who needs them, why do they need it, how can I reach them, how can I explain them, why it's good for them, how can I help them to try it out, how can I actually get to the point where I try to make them use my API. It is done for those companies who make their business out of selling API access, right? So these companies, of course, are doing it, but that's a tiny slice of who's using APIs nowadays. And I think we need API marketing to be a much more widely applied principle for all APIs that we create, not just for the externally facing monetized APIs that we want to sell access to. So I think and I hope that API marketing also is something that we will see becoming more important as a part of API management in the future. And with that, I am done. So what I wanted to tell you was just this idea of that APIs are, I think, one of the critical factors of digital transformation, but that just having them is not good enough, and that one big aspect of making them more successful is to think about the network effect. How do I get more people to use them? And how do I get to the point where the network effect is basically taking off? And I gave you a couple of kind of tactical ideas around how to do this. And then also, of course, there should be a strategy around that where over time you have a good idea of how to grow your API landscape and how to make that an important part of your API platform. And with that, I'd like to thank you for listening. If you're interested in the slides, you can find them here. If you're interested in me, you can find me on Twitter, YouTube, and LinkedIn. And that was it. Thank you very much.